In the winter of 1933, when the last bus to Briar's End had already stopped running for the season, and the rutted road was a ribbon of frozen mud the color of old bruises, every door in the Hollow House began to ring its bell at once, and the people in town told each other that whoever answered those bells next would not leave the place with the same name, the same breath, or the same bones. Mariel Vance did not believe the town when it tried to warn her, because belief never paid rent, and superstition never filled a pantry, and because the foreman at the textile mill had shrugged his bald shoulders at the door of his tiny office and told her that there was no more work that week, or perhaps the next, and that he could only promise to send word if the looms ever sang as they had before the Troubles, and because Mrs. Harrow at the rooming house had said she could wait 2 days for the rent and not a day more, and because a woman with a cook's cap and a jaw like a chopping block had stopped her on the street and said there was always work in a big house when the little ones were failing, provided the girl could keep quiet, keep hours, and keep her eyes to herself. The woman gave a name that was not really a name, because everyone in Briar's End called her simply Gorse, and said that she cooked for a widow who had once possessed a face that drew glances like moths to a lantern, and rooms that overflowed with company and music and smoke, and that now possessed only rooms, piles of them stacked atop one another like empty boxes with the lids half shut, and a face as pale as a gourd left in a root cellar, and a spine that kept its secrets by refusing to stand, and a set of bell pulls that had been installed in a more gracious age when the width of a hallway measured a family's pride, and a black lacquered cradle by the upstairs landing that had held nothing but a folded quilt since the year before the mine closed, and a habit, among other habits, of letting help go without notice because the help could not handle a house whose silence behaved like a person waiting for a reply. Mariel took the job because she owned a single good pair of shoes with the soles stitched and restitched until the thread looked like centipede legs, and a willow-colored coat with a frayed collar that refused to lie flat, and a sharp sense that the town had begun to tilt away from her, as if she had done something to make it uncomfortable, and because Gorse said the house paid in cash at the end of every week and fed its servants as if it wanted to keep their hands from shaking, and because when Mariel wrapped her scarf twice around her throat and tucked her braid beneath her hat and followed Gorse up the hill, it felt like a choice that would end with a door, and some doors, once they open, do not close until they have taken something in. The Hollow House stood on a rise beyond the abandoned depot, where the rails still pointed like broken needles toward places that no longer cared to send anything back, and it wore its age like a heavy winter garment that could not be shaken off, and its eaves were thick with icicles that looked like teeth, and the windows were tall and narrow with eyelids of stained glass that had been expensive 60 years earlier, and the front steps sagged in the center as if too many feet had learned the same lesson at the same place, and the ironwork along the porch rail curled like handwriting in a language that had forgotten its vowels, and the front door was fitted with a brass knocker the size of a child's head that left a faint green ghost on the wood wherever someone dared to lift and drop it. Gorse did not lift the knocker because she had a key, a stout thing that made a sound as it turned like a shovel biting the edge of a stone, and the lock yielded as if humiliated by the familiarity, and the entry hall expanded around them with the stale breath of shut rooms, and a smell that blended old polish with a trace of coal smoke, and something floral that had been poured too generously and too long ago, and a row of servant bells gleamed on the wall like small brass suns, each with a porcelain label in neat copper plate. Parlor, study, green bedroom, nursery, east gallery, master, and each with a slight tremor in its spring as if a vibration traveled continually from the wire from somewhere unseen. "Clockwork still running," Gorse said, and her voice did not echo because the carpets in the hall were thick enough to swallow sound, and her eyes traveled to the bells the way a soldier's eyes travel to a ridge, and then to Mariel's hands with the more ordinary calculation of a woman who needs to know whether the new girl will break the good china out of clumsiness or out of spite,
and that the house shows better than it lives. So you will keep your face polite to the furniture, even if it fails to return the courtesy. And you will not remove the covers from the mirrors, because the madam does not tolerate them, and I do not tolerate disobedience. And you will remember that the bells can ring for any reason at any hour, and that when they do, you will come at once, as if the floor itself were instructing you to move." Mariel nodded because there was nothing else to do, and because the house drew assent out of a person in the same way that a cold room draws breath. And she followed Gorse down a side corridor past a door that stood an inch ajar, just enough to show a strip of black wallpaper patterned with vines and birds whose beaks carried strips of ribbon. And she said nothing when Gorse pushed the door shut with 2 fingers and said the room was not to be used in winter because the chimney in that part of the house had a habit of coughing soot without warning. And they reached the kitchen where a black stove sat like a throne without anyone to sit on it, and a row of knives hung like punctuation, and a narrow window looked out over a backyard full of bald lilac bushes that divided the property from a stand of maples, gray and muscular. And beyond that, the earth rose toward the slag heap from the old mine, which had frozen into a shape like a wave that would never fall. "Tea first," Gorse said, "because all great enterprises that do not involve childbirth or fire begin with tea," and she poured 2 cups from a pot that had been steeping long enough to pretend to be coffee if one added sugar with a stubborn hand, and she said the widow's name in a flat tone that made it sound like an order, Mrs. Ada Calder, and explained that the widow had been widowed so long that the words started to describe the house as well as the person, and that she had fallen down the staircase in a season whose name no one said anymore because saying it made people remember the other things that had fallen at the same time, and that she had not stood since, not because her bones could not bear her, but because something had gone wrong between intention and action. A wire cut in a well-made clock, a hinge that refused its duty, a door that believed itself a wall.
Gorse carried a tray that smelled of broth and toasted bread and the clean salt of butter, and Mariel followed with a cloth folded over her arm, because this was the kind of house where a cloth folded over an arm makes a person's hands behave. And they climbed a staircase that curved like a listening ear, and along the landing, 3 tall windows had been dressed in paper shades that let in a tired light, and a black cradle sat beneath the last window with its quilt folded as carefully as a handkerchief kept for a funeral, and the bells glimmered again in Mariel's mind because she did not need to look at them to know they were there. And Gorse led her to a door with a brass plate that had once said "Master," and now said nothing, because the brass had been rubbed blank by an unoccupied life. Inside, Mrs. Ada Calder lay under a layered quilt, whose squares had been cut from dresses in 20 different shades of brown and burgundy and ash, and the arrangement made a landscape so subdued that it dared the eye to remark upon it. And the woman's hair had gone white in a theatrical way, every strand obedient and smooth, and her hands lay atop the quilt like well-fed spiders, slim and perfectly still, until Gorse set the tray on the bedside table, at which point the right hand moved, without trembling, toward the cup, as if the distance had already been measured before any of them entered the room. "You must be the new one," Mrs. Calder said, and her voice carried the soft power of a cushion that does not make a sound when it takes a person's weight and then refuses to give that weight back. And she looked at Mariel, not at Gorse, because cooks, however necessary, are furniture that insists on talking, and maids, however replaceable, have faces that can be learned, and you must believe that your life before this room will continue to exist while you cross its threshold, which is a sweet and understandable mistake, and you must understand that service in a house like this is a profession like any other, practiced best when one refuses to confuse nerve with stubbornness, and kindness with weakness, and endurance with consent. Mariel said that her name was Mariel Vance,
And Mrs. Calder repeated the name as if it were a tune she could decide to enjoy or not, and she asked where the girl came from and how long she planned to stay, and whether she had anyone who would miss her if she stayed longer than planned. And when the questions had drawn an outline sufficient to content her, she lifted her left hand, steady, steady, and touched Mariel's wrist with precisely 2 fingers in the place where a pulse says, "Hello." And she smiled without showing teeth, and she said that the young always forget how loudly their blood speaks, and that some houses require quiet. Gorse made a sound in her throat, not quite a cough, and not quite a warning, and Mrs. Calder's hand withdrew without hurry and without apology. And she asked for the book from the bedside table, which was not a Bible, although it had the weight and the binding of something that expected to be taken seriously. And she asked Mariel to read aloud from the ribboned page. And the words were not scripture and not poetry and not household accounts, and they lay at first like dust on Mariel's tongue, and then like the memory of a place she had not visited but could describe if pressed. And she read until her mouth felt lacquered with the repetition, and when she raised her eyes from the page, she found that Mrs. Calder was not listening to the words with her ears so much as with the smoothness of her face, which remained as calm as a bed made tight by a woman who never forgave a wrinkle. When the reading ended, Mrs. Calder said that the tea had gone lukewarm, which was the kind of observation that contains a whole world of blame if one lifts it to the light. And Gorse lifted the tray and nodded to Mariel in a way that meant the lesson had begun and would continue later. And in the hall, Gorse told her to scrub to the elbow with the lye soap until the skin felt honest but not raw, and to use the pumice at the wrist if the spot where Mrs. Calder had touched her retained any sensation that did not feel like her own, and to eat quickly and not spill on the apron, because the madam hated stains almost as much as she hated dust. Mariel did as she was told, because obedience bought time to learn the shape of what cannot be obeyed forever, and when she stood at the scullery basin with her sleeves rolled and the water steaming like a polite ghost, she noticed that the very place where Mrs. Calder's fingers had rested burned as if a nettle had stung it, and then blown cold as if a window had opened above a bed. And she washed until her skin shone pink, and the heat withdrew, and a faint pale line remained where there had been no line before, as if a thread had been stitched just under the skin and then pulled tight and tied off. The first week at the Hollow House behaved itself like a week anywhere else if one did not listen too closely to the bells, and Mariel learned the paths that made the old floorboards kind, and the patterns that polished the table without discovering what the wood had seen, and the habit of folding the corner of the bedsheet exactly the way the house preferred, and the locations of 3 drafty keyholes that embarrassed candles, and 2 places where the wallpaper curled back like a hungover tongue. And she met the handyman, Mr. Pritch, who wore a cap even in bed, and never looked a person in the full face if that person could carry a bucket. And she began to understand that Gorse believed in order the way some people believe in penance, and that the house believed in repetition the way some people believe in salvation.
The second week did not pretend to be ordinary because nothing in the Hollow House had the energy to pretend for long, and on a Tuesday gray enough to be mistaken for a Wednesday, the nursery bell rang, though there had been no child in the house for 20 years, and Gorse froze with a bread knife over a loaf in a posture so perfect it could have been an illustration labeled "Woman Interrupted," and she said that Mariel would go up and see what was wanted, and Mariel said there was no one in the nursery, and Gorse said that doors do not ring bells. And Mariel wiped her hands on her apron and went up the side staircase that ran so steeply it seemed to desire to be a ladder. And the nursery door stood half open, and the air in the room was thin and oddly high, as if one had climbed a hill without moving. And the cradle by the window contained nothing but that carefully folded quilt, and the pole by the fireplace trembled on its spring as if someone had just let it go. "Madam?" Mariel asked into the room because manners provide a handhold in places where the floor tilts, and there was no answer except the sound of the house's breath moving in the vents. And she crossed the room and laid a hand on the cradle's edge because people do such things without knowing why, and the wood felt warm as if a small animal had slept there until a moment before, and she did not move the quilt because there are thresholds inside thresholds, and she had crossed enough for one errand, and she returned to the kitchen. And Gorse nodded once without asking questions, and they returned to their work with a care that resembles indifference when practiced by professionals. That night, when the lamps in the hall had been lowered and the upstairs windows had been cracked for air and then fastened again because the house did not like air that it had not asked for, Mariel sat on the servant's cot with a needle and thread and mended a seam on the sleeve of her willow coat, and the prickle beneath the skin of her wrist settled into an ache that had begun to count time in its own way, and the bells in the hall sang once a polite little chorus as if to confirm they were still employed, and she slept with her hands folded beneath her cheek because she had learned the habit from an aunt who believed a person's face will repay kindness if greeted with kindness first thing. The following afternoon, sunlight struggled in through the stairwell window and failed to make it to the carpet, and Mrs. Calder asked for her book and then did not ask for it to be read, and instead motioned Mariel closer with the smallest inclination of her chin. And Mariel obeyed, because there's nothing in the world more powerful than a quiet instruction delivered by someone who never raises her voice. And when she stood within arm's reach, Mrs. Calder lifted that same right hand and traced the faint line at Mariel's wrist with the tip of her smallest finger, which she held slightly apart from the others as if it were left-handed in a right-handed family. And the touch was neither cold nor warm, but a kind of exactness that left the flesh tingling with the knowledge of having been counted. "You do not flinch, which is admirable," Mrs. Calder said, and she smiled in a manner that suggested the room had arranged itself to suit her rather than the other way around. "And you do not ask questions, which is either wisdom or hunger disguised as wisdom. And you carry yourself as if you have spent a very long time trying to become smaller without losing your height. And I approve of your discipline while regretting its cause. And I would like you to tell me whether there is anyone you would not leave behind if leaving became a choice that had to be made quickly." Mariel said that there was no one who would not eventually learn to manage without her because it seemed an answer that would keep the room still, and Mrs. Calder nodded with an expression that combined pity with triumph and a ratio the house recognized and enjoyed, and she asked for the pillows to be adjusted, and Mariel reached to lift the weight of the old woman's shoulders with the practiced cradle of an arm that could balance a coal scuttle without spilling, and when she leaned in, the movement that came next arrived with such measured certainty that a person watching would have sworn it had been rehearsed for weeks. Mrs. Calder's hands rose, neither shaking nor hurrying, and settled against Mariel's temples with the tenderness of a mother and the precision of a locksmith, and her thumbs moved to the small hollows just above the cheekbones where pressure makes a person's eyes want to close, and a sound came from the bells in the hall that was not a ring so much as a long intake, and Mariel tried to step back and found that stepping no longer described what her legs did, and the room slid a degree to the right, the way a landscape slides when a train begins to move, while the mind insists the platform must be doing the motion, and the edges of the quilt swam like a pond scummed with pollen, and something in the back of her head opened not like a door but like a drawer that had always existed and simply waited for a hand to know where to press. Mariel did not fall, she arrived, and the place of her arriving was a body that had learned stillness so thoroughly that movement felt like a memory someone else had told and she had believed out of politeness. And the first thing she saw, because it stood directly before her, was her own face, the one she had washed every morning and wiped with a towel that smelled faintly of lye in winter. And the face looked back at her with interest but without surprise, and the mouth shaped a smile so convincing that it remade the features around it, and the eyes held something like dawn and something like arithmetic and something like gratitude that contained no warmth. "Thank you," said Mariel's voice, but the sentence belonged unmistakably to Mrs. Calder, and the timbre of ownership runs deeper than the sound of a person's throat, and she stepped back and tested Mariel's hands as if trying a pair of gloves that one suspects might be better than one deserves, and she looked down at her borrowed wrist and tilted the smallest finger outward, amused to see how readily the gesture fit. And she reached for the cup on the bedside table and lifted it and drank as if thirst had been her only problem, and the rest did not merit language. Mariel, who was not in her body but in the bed, lifted arms that did not rise, and felt the ache of old joints that had learned to rehearse pain in case it ever forgot its lines, and she discovered the bell rope beside the bed with a new recognition, and she pulled it 3 times with the determination of a woman who knows a handful of knots that can hold a boat in a storm or a person in a promise. And the sound it made went down the wire like water down a pipe and into the kitchen where Gorse kept the laws of the house. Footsteps came as if the hallway had moved them on its own, and Gorse entered with a face that had boiled away anything that was useful and left a residue of iron, and she looked at the bed, then at the body standing beside it, then at the bed again, and her hand moved to the pocket where she kept a small pair of shears that could snip a chicken's backbone in 3 quick bites, and she said nothing because there are moments when words perform a smaller service than silence, and then she crossed the room not hastily but without waste, and seized the wrist of the young woman whose shape was Mariel and whose posture was not, and turned the hand so that the palm showed its lines, and she nodded once as if to a familiar adversary, and she said to the woman in the bed, "You call the law if you want, but you will wait until we decide what needs a witness."
The woman in Mariel's body, Ada now, entire and alive in a way that made youth look like a form of cruelty, smiled again because some gestures feel too good to abandon, and she said there was no need to involve men who write things down, and she offered a trade with the shameless confidence of those who have never paid full price, and she said she would leave the house and the name and the bells. She would leave the room and the town and the habits and the chair by the upstairs window where winter often paused to watch itself. But she would not leave the body, because debt had to be paid with coin of the realm, and time is a currency that respects no other. Mariel rented to say that the bargain did not contain the shape of justice, and that fairness mattered to her less than accuracy, and that accuracy required the person who had been stolen to be returned to the place from which she had been taken, and that even a house as fond of rules as this one ought to acknowledge the difference between replacement and restoration. But the mouth available to her did not cooperate with such sentences because the muscles had been trained on a different set of priorities, and she said instead, in a voice that carried more gravel than air, that Ada could keep the skin if she would keep away from the one person in the county who pronounced the name Mariel like a decision rather than a question, and that she would never come back through this door or any door that led to the rooms where Mariel had kept her breath, and that if she broke that promise, the house would know and would refuse to forgive either of them. Ada considered, weighing what she had already taken against what remained to be stolen, and she inclined her head in a courtly motion whose elegance belonged to a century that had not survived the stairs. And she said she would keep her bargain because a thief who understands the accounting lives longer than one who does not, and she smoothed the front of the apron she wore because hands in a bar of life need something to do, and she left the room without glancing back, and her footsteps on the landing sounded like the footsteps of a woman who had never once worried about how a hallway feels when it watches you go. Gorse closed the door with the finality of a book that will not be reopened without reason, and she sat down in the chair by the bed and folded her arms and told Mariel, who was Ada now in everything except conviction, that breathing would be the next useful business, and that she would help with that, and that afterward they would see whether the old body wished to eat or drink or curse or sleep, and that the order did not matter as much as the doing, and that she had seen one exchange at this house before and had cleaned up the floorboards afterward, and that this time she meant to keep ahead of the mess. Days learned to pass again, because time will perform its tricks whether or not anyone applauds, and the house accepted the new arrangement with the relief of furniture returned to the positions it secretly prefers, and Mariel mastered the elevator of breath that lifts and falls without consulting the legs, and she learned the useful distances in a room where the hand can reach the bell and the glass and the lamp chain and the edge of a book, and she learned the taste of medicines whose labels called themselves tonics and whose contents confessed themselves punishments, and she learned the schedules of light people never notice until windows become clocks, and she learned that Gorse had invented a way of caring that did not require kindness every hour, but demanded competence every minute. Mr. Pritch oiled hinges and said nothing. The handyman's loyalty belonged to the geometry of things that open and close, and the bells rang when they ought not and stayed still when they should have rung, because wires behave badly when secrets travel down them, and twice at the bare edge of dawn, Mariel heard footsteps outside the bedroom door that paused precisely where a person would pause if measuring courage, and she knew without proof that Ada had returned to take the temperature of her promise, and that the temperature suited her because she left each time without asking to be let in. On a day that had the sharp taste of a coin held between teeth, Gorse straightened the crooked photograph in the upstairs hall that showed a woman with a pearl pin at her throat standing on the front steps of a house that looked like the Hollow House but had been softened by a season of laughter, and Gorse said that a crooked picture is a temptation to fate and that she had no patience for fate. And Mariel saw, in the instant after the frame aligned with the molding, that the woman in the photograph held her chin a fraction lower and her mouth a fraction softer, and that the pearls at her throat had become a little smaller, as if the image had relinquished a degree of entitlement, and she understood in a way that did not require words that Ada would not test the door of this room again. Winter gave way with its usual reluctance and its usual drama, and the mud arrived and reminded the county what a body looks like when it forgets to be a road. And Gorse baked bread that inflated the kitchen with an ambition nearly joyful. And Mr. Pritch repaired a section of plaster above the parlor mantel where a long crack had traced a route like a map of grief. And Mariel asked for the window to be opened not a finger's width, but two, and she endured the draft with the dignity of someone who has decided to forgive the air. In late March, when the sycamores along the lane clicked like bones being counted, Ada returned once, wearing Mariel's face with casual authority and a plain dress with a mended hem that did not apologize for the stitch,
and she stood on the threshold like a guest who has learned the exact distance between entitlement and permission, and she set a small object on the dresser, a round silver coin with a hole punched near the rim, as if someone meant to string it. And she said that a debt had been repaid for something neither of them could name without losing more than they gained, and she looked at the covered mirror and did not touch the cloth. And she left before Gorse could walk from the kitchen to the landing and announced that visiting hours never existed in this house and never would.
Mariel slept well that night, and this does not mean she was content or reconciled or happy in any conventional sense. It means only that she had learned to let the body rest when the mind cannot, which is knowledge that belongs to people who have carried too many things that cannot be put down. And in the morning, she asked Gorse to place the coin on the frame of the photograph in the hall, and Gorse did so without asking why, because questions are a luxury purchased with surplus, and the house felt, if a house can feel, less eager to witness and more willing to host. Visitors came because big houses attract small hopes, and the agent from town arrived with two couples who wanted to see whether wealth might look good on them if they tried it on for a season, and they spoke in lowered voices as if the walls were asleep and could be woken. And they asked whether the bells still worked, and whether the nursery could be made into a sitting room, and whether the foundation had shifted, and whether the widow would sell. And Gorse escorted them with a smile she had ironed into perfect reliability. And Mariel listened from the bed and understood that some doors never stop asking to be used, even when the hinges complain. One evening, when the lamps wore their shades like thoughtful hats, and the air in the bedroom had the clean taste that follows boiled linen, Gorse set a tray with chamomile and a square of ginger cake on the table, and asked in her flattest tone whether the madam required anything else. And Mariel told her that names matter whether or not the person who carries them remains the same size and shape, and that she would answer to Mrs. Vance in this room because it permitted a future tense, and that in the ledger Gorse kept in the pantry, where the week's purchases and wages lived in tidy columns, the entry at the top ought to read, House, Paid, because the house, if owed something, had collected it, and if not owed, had still taken it. And Gorse nodded and wrote nothing down because the only ledgers that balance in old houses are the ones that live in the ribs. The bells did not fall silent because the house did not. They rang for towels and tea, and once, astonishingly, for laughter, when Gorse slipped on a drop of gravy and saved herself by seizing the ear of a brass urn that had belonged to someone who would have hated such use. And she leaned in the doorway and laughed until she nearly cried, and Mariel laughed with her, and the sound did not bruise the room, which counted as a miracle in a town that had stopped expecting them. As spring took the hill and the maples budded and the mine pile shed its snow, the hollow house remained itself, and yet not, because a place that has admitted a new name cannot help but practice its syllables. And on a Sunday evening that held more light than the Sunday before, a knock came at the back door, small and formal, and Mr. Pritch admitted a girl with a hat that had belonged to an older sister, and a mouth that wanted to be brave while remaining cautious. And Gorse said there was always work in a big house when the little ones failed. And Mariel, who had begun to understand that telling the truth sometimes requires the courtesy of gravity, told the girl that the bells would ring at any hour for any reason, and that she should wash to the elbow after attending the madam and before eating pie, and that she should keep her questions for the moments when answers could be useful rather than beautiful, and that if a door stood half open in a room where no door had stood before, she should fetch Gorse first and curiosity later. The girl looked at Mariel the way people look at a portrait that has learned to breathe, and she nodded and folded her hands in a posture that was either reverence or preparation. And the bells murmured once and then resumed their poise, and outside the maples worked at their leaves with the patience of entities that have never hurried, and the house considered itself and decided to go on. If a person in Briar's End asks years later what happened to the girl who answered the bells the winter the roads went hard and the clocks forgot about the afternoons, the best answer is the one Gorse gives when she is in no mood for embroidery, which is that the house kept its bargain in the only way a house can, and that the woman upstairs took a new name and an old posture and learned how to breathe like a person who has traded one set of rooms for another, and that the bells still call and the doors still open and the knives still hang like punctuation in a sentence that rarely ends, and that the hollow house is not haunted so much as practicing, which is what people call it when a place refuses to surrender the idea of being lived in. And if someone presses for a sharper ending, for a last shock or a final scream, for the kind of closure that makes fear feel like entertainment, Gorse will shake flour from her apron and say that endings are for stories, and houses prefer continuations, and Mariel will lift her cup and drink the tea while it is hot, and the bells will remain quiet until quiet stops being useful, and the new maid will go upstairs with a tray, and the door will open as if it had been waiting with all the patience in the world, because it has. If you've listened this far, Congratulations. That means the house didn't keep you. But before you leave, it's polite to leave an offering. Not money, not blood, just a click on subscribe button. It keeps the spirits calm. It keeps the next story coming. And if you forget, well, the house remembers. So, go on, click it. Let's keep this haunting mutual.